Welcome to the Military Aviation Preservation Society American History Program. In this segment of our classroom support package, we will be reviewing how non-interventionists have impacted the American experience, how non-intervention policies have caused conflict in this country, and what the ultimate cost of those policies were. This program was designed to support high school classroom instruction dealing with American History Content Statement 20 and addresses how World War I impacted this nation and how non-interventionist groups and media figures of the time shaped the political landscape in the United States prior to World War II. We also hope that this presentation will deepen your understanding of how today's global society impacts the concepts of isolationism and non-interventionism. One of the first items that needs to be addressed in the discussion of this subject is the difference between the terms non-intervention or non-interventionism and isolationism. Those terms have too often been used interchangeably, which leads many to confusion and conflict. Isolationism dictates that a country should have no relations with the rest of the world. In its purest form, this would mean that ambassadors would not be shared with other nations. Communications with foreign governments would be minimal, and that commercial relations and international trade would be non-existent. Non-intervention or non-interventionism, on the other hand, is a foreign policy that holds that nations should avoid alliances with other nations, but still retain diplomatic relations. A central theme is to avoid all wars not related to direct self-defense. A non-interventionist believes that the United States should not intercede in conflicts between other nations or conflicts within nations. A non-interventionist does, however, support commercial relations, free trade, travel, cultural exchange, and supports the exchange of ambassadors with all willing nations. Giving these two widely differing definitions, we can probably classify American isolationist movements and interest groups throughout our history to be mostly non-interventionist in nature. Non-interventionism has, throughout the history of this country, and even up to the current day, been a highly emotional concept with good arguments to support the position of both sides. Even today, there are probably widely differing positions on current American involvement in foreign nations. While that is an important area for discussion, we will try to focus this presentation on America's non-interventionist policies, how they might have been perceived by other nations, and how that perception may have led us into war in 1941. There has always been a strong non-interventionist streak in American political life. It was one of the most powerful political movements in American history. Americans, separated by two great oceans, have, since the Revolution, seen ourselves as different and apart from the rest of the world. The American colonies were populated by many people who had fled from Europe, where they were often subject to religious persecution, economic privation, and war. Their new homeland was looked upon as a place to make things better than the old ways. A number of American presidents also supported early non-intervention policies. George Washington, in his farewell address, focused on non-intervention when he said, "The great rule of conduct for us, in regard to foreign nations, is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible." America's third president, Thomas Jefferson, stated in his inaugural address, "Peace, commerce, and honest friendships with all nations, entangling alliances with none." President James Monroe made the following comment in what would be later termed the Monroe Doctrine when he said, "In the wars of the European powers, in matters relating to themselves, we have never taken part, nor does it comport with our policy to do so. That doctrine also stated that further efforts by European nations to colonize land or interfere with nations in North or South America would be viewed as acts of aggression requiring U.S. intervention. As our founding fathers indicated, American non-interventionism did not mean disengagement from the world stage. Americans were not averse to the idea that the United States should be a world player and even further its territorial, ideological, and economic interest, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, a philosophy that came to be known as manifest destiny. This was the widely held belief early in the history of the United States that American settlers were destined to expand throughout the continent. This belief brought the colonists and later many Western moving settlers often into violent conflict with North America's original occupants, who did not agree with this invasion of the homelands of their ancestors. Non-interventionism on the part of the United States over the course of its history was more of a desire to protect the United States' political and economic interest than a desire to keep out the rest of the world. The United States policy of non-intervention was maintained throughout most of the 19th century. The first significant foreign intervention by the United States was the Spanish-American War, which occurred in 1898. Trouble started when the U.S. intervened in the Cuban War of Independence from Spain, and heated up with the sinking of the American battleship Maine. One of the outcomes of this little-studied war was the United States occupation of the Philippines. America's participation in World War I against the Central Powers marked its first major departure from non-intervention policy. World War I proved to be a vast killing field, destroying a generation of men. The idea of American isolationism became popular after World War I. The war had left many Americans with a feeling of distrust of Europe and wondering whether the deaths and sacrifices of World War I had been worthwhile. It also convinced many Americans that America must not get involved in any future European wars. Isolationism was further fueled by the suspicion that massive amounts of money made by the munitions industry and arms manufacturers played a major role in the U.S. involvement in the Great War. When the First World War ended, the United States was quick to leave behind its European commitment. Immediately following the First World War, Congress rejected U.S. membership in the League of Nations. Some members of Congress opposed membership in the League out of concern that it would draw the United States into European conflicts, citing a clause in the League's charter requiring member nations to come to the aid of other members in need. The United States had, however, emerged from World War I as a world military, political, and industrial leader. Despite the fact that the United States had failed to become a member of the League of Nations, it continued to engage in international negotiations and treaties. America was now too powerful to be able to effectively avoid political involvement in international affairs, and also found itself economically reliant on other countries. It had become vital for the American economy for Europeans to buy American exports. In effect, we wanted the foreign markets without any ties to those foreign governments. The American foreign policy of isolationism in the 1920s was a diplomatic and economic doctrine aimed at self-advancement to make the United States economically self-reliant while still retaining peaceful relations with other nations. It attempted to isolate the United States from the diplomatic affairs of other countries by avoiding foreign entanglements and not entering into alliances with other countries. Additionally, tariffs were imposed on foreign goods to shield U.S. manufacturers from overseas competition. This concept, commonly known as protectionism, is the economic policy of restricting imports from other countries through methods such as tariffs on imported goods, import quotas, and a variety of other government regulations. The 1922 Ford-Nemecumber Act was passed introducing the highest tariffs in American history. However, these measures backfired. In response to these tariffs, European countries imposed a similar tax on American goods, making them too expensive to buy in Europe. This significantly restricted trade and may have contributed to the Great Depression of the 1930s. President Roosevelt reversed a number of these tariffs in 1934, realizing that they were doing more harm than good. During the 1920s and 30s, the combination of the Great Depression, the need for increased attention to domestic problems, and memory of tragic losses in World War I contributed to focusing American public opinion toward non-intervention. These factors served to support the idea that the United States should isolate itself from troubling events in Europe. Americans believed that radical political movements and ideologies such as socialism, communism, and anarchism were European in origin and threatened political stability in the United States. Although the United States took measures to avoid political and military conflicts across the ocean, it continued to expand economically and protect its interests, particularly in Latin America. Isolationist ideas were also spread through the media and American popular culture during the mid-1930s. The 1934 publication of the book, Merchants of Death, followed by War is a Racket, increased public suspicion of wartime profiteering. In 1934, the Nye Committee, a committee of the United States Senate, was established to investigate the financial interest behind the United States' involvement in World War I. The committee report detailed the massive profits made by arms manufacturers and commented on the influence that munitions industry held on American foreign policy leading up to and during the war. Disillusionment over World War I fed opposition to foreign entanglements and support for the policy of American isolationism. An opinion poll taken in 1935 found that 70% of Americans believed that the intervention in World War I had been a mistake. American isolationism was also gaining support from the younger generation. Another 1935 public opinion poll indicated that 39% of college students would refuse to participate in any war, even if the country was invaded. Near the mid-20th century, events were occurring overseas that would challenge and then end America's non-intervention policy. The advent of German and Japanese expansionism would threaten and later nearly end the isolation enjoyed by the United States. The aggressive and expansionist policies of Italy, Germany, and Japan sent out strong warning signals that the world might be headed for yet another major international war. Still, the majority of Americans at that time favored isolationism, fearing America would be dragged into another war. This apparent aversion to conflict among Western nations may have laid the groundwork for German and Japanese aggression. Appeasement policies enacted during the 1930s had convinced Adolf Hitler and German leadership that the West was so traumatized by World War I that those countries did not want to fight. There was a utopian and pacifist political correctness to non-intervention policies that to Hitler represented a weakness to be exploited. He mistakenly assumed that America's isolationism would mean that it would not move millions of soldiers to Europe as it had in World War I. Similarly, Japanese leadership thought if America had let France be occupied and Great Britain burn in 1940, then they would probably not go into China, Malaysia, or Southeast Asia to rescue their colonial allies. During this turbulent period of the 1930s, President Roosevelt was battling the financial crisis and introducing the New Deal programs to address the devastating effects of the Great Depression to bring about economic recovery. The Depression lingered until orders for war materials from Europe began to flood into America in the late 1930s. Although we did not emphasize it in our studies, the rest of the world was also affected by the Depression. Britain and France particularly also struggled with the economic downturn. The response in Germany and Japan, however, was totalitarianism, militarism, and finally, war. When the war began in September of 1939, most Americans demanded neutrality regarding Europe. Although most Americans supported strong measures against Japan, Europe was the focus of most of the non-interventionist attentions. The public mood was changing, however, especially after the fall of France in the spring of 1940. The year 1940 signaled a final turning point for non-interventionism. German military successes in Europe and the Battle of Britain prompted nationwide American rethinking about its posture toward war. If Germany and Italy established empires in Europe and Africa, and Japan swept East Asia, many believed that the Western Hemisphere might be next. Even if America managed to repel invasions, its way of life would be changed for the worse if it were forced to become a garrison state, isolated from the rest of the world. By the autumn of 1940, many Americans believed it was necessary to help defeat the Axis, even if it meant open hostilities. The war in Europe split the American people into two camps, non-interventionists and interventionists. The two sides argued over America's involvement in this Second World War, but because the non-interventionists faced no consistent organized opposition, their message was the only one heard. Roosevelt appeared to accept the strength of the non-interventionist elements in Congress until 1937. In that year, he gave a speech in which he likened international aggression to a disease that other nations must work to quarantine. At the time, however, Americans were still not prepared to risk their lives and livelihoods for peace abroad. Due to the public opposition of American isolationists, the U.S. did not join the Second World War when it broke out in Europe, and declared its neutrality on September 5, 1939. Strong anti-war and non-interventionist sentiments were expressed by the America First Committee, a group who favored isolationism and staunchly opposed U.S. intervention or providing aid to the Allies. Founded in September of 1940, America First was the foremost non-interventionist pressure group against the American entry into World War II. Peaking at 800,000 paid members in 450 chapters, it was one of the largest anti-war organizations in American history. It gained much of its early strength by merging with the more left-wing Keep America Out of War Committee. It tried to influence public opinion through publications and speeches. America First disagreed with another powerful group, the Committee to Defend America by Aiding the Allies. Both groups wanted to build American defenses and keep America out of the war, but the Committee to Defend America argued that the best way to remain neutral was to aid Britain. America First thought it more important to stay out of the war than to assure a British victory. As with any group that wishes to get public and political support for their viewpoints, they needed a prominent public figure, someone with face recognition, to serve as their spokesman. This is still true today in the advertising business. If you want to sell a product, you find someone that the public recognizes and admires. In late 1940, national hero and aviator Charles Lindbergh became spokesman of the anti-war America First Committee. Speaking to overflow crowds in Madison Square Garden in New York City and Soldier Field in Chicago, his speeches were heard by millions. Lindbergh argued that America did not have any business getting involved in foreign conflict, particularly as it involved Europe, and believed in upholding the Monroe Doctrine, which his rivals felt was outdated. Lindbergh had always preached military strength and alertness. He believed that a strong defensive war machine would make America an impenetrable fortress and defend the Western Hemisphere from an attack by any foreign power. He indicated that this was the U.S. military's sole purpose. Lindbergh also felt that America could not win a war against Germany's war machine, particularly its air arm, the Luftwaffe. Between 1936 and 1938, at the request of the U.S. military, he traveled several times to Germany to report on German aviation and the German Air Force. With the approval of the German High Command, Lindbergh was the first American permitted to examine the Luftwaffe's newest bomber, the Junkers Ju-88, and Germany's frontline fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. As 1940 became 1941, the Roosevelt administration made it very clear that the United States was on a course for war. He explained the importance of supplying the people of Europe, at the time primarily Britain, with the implements of war. In a radio broadcast to the American people on December 29, 1940, he said that the United States must be the great arsenal of democracy. The President managed not only to support Britain in its hour of need, but laid the groundwork for producing a tidal wave of equipment and supplies not only for the American military, but for our allies as well, in quantities that no one, especially the Axis countries, believed possible. This policy shift, driven by the President, came in two phases. The first came in 1939, with the passage of the Fourth Neutrality Act, which permitted the United States to trade arms with other nations at war, as long as those nations came to America to receive the arms and pay for them in cash. This policy was quickly dubbed cash and carry. The second phase was the Lend-Lease Act of early 1941. This act allowed the President to lend, lease, sell, or barter arms, ammunition, food, or any defense article, or any defense information to the government of any country whose defense the President deemed vital to the defense of the United States. Lend-Lease was designed to serve America's interest in defeating Nazi Germany without entering the war until the American military and public were prepared to fight. At a time when the majority of Americans opposed direct participation in the war, Lend-Lease represented a vital U.S. contribution to the fight against Nazi Germany. The 1941 Lend-Lease Act removed the cash requirement of the Neutrality Acts of the 1930, allowing the Allies continued access to American arms, munitions, and supplies, despite their rapidly deteriorating financial situation. In June of 1941, Germany launched a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, and Lend-Lease aid was extended to the USSR. China was already benefiting, with U.S. financial, equipment, and supplies supporting their war against the Japanese, despite an uneasy truce between nationalist and communist factions in that country. Many members of the isolationist movement were furious that the U.S. was supporting the Soviet Union and its communist regime. The view being expressed by the isolationists was that the fascists, Nazis, and communists should be left to fight it out alone. On January 23, 1941, during his testimony in opposition to the Lend-Lease Bill before the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, Charles Lindbergh proposed that the United States negotiate a neutrality pact with Germany. President Roosevelt publicly criticized Lindbergh's views on neutrality 3 months later as being those of a defeatist and appeaser. 3 days later, Lindbergh resigned his commission as a colonel in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Then Lindbergh made a speech that made some question his credibility. In a speech at an America First rally at the Des Moines Coliseum on September 11, 1941, titled, "Who are the War Agitators?" Charles Lindbergh made the following statement. The three most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. In discussing the Jewish influence in the United States in his speech, he stated that their greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. But then, in the same speech, he went on to condemn Nazi Germany's anti-Semitism when he said, "No person with a sense of dignity of mankind can condone the persecution of the Jewish race in Germany." The non-interventionist failed to prevent the Roosevelt administration from supporting the targets of Axis aggression. Most Americans still opposed any actual declaration of war on Axis countries, but everything abruptly changed on December 7th, when Japanese naval forces attacked Pearl Harbor. Even as the bombs were falling on Pearl, the America First organization staged a major rally in Pittsburgh. In a hall decorated with red, white, and blue wall banners, the America First leaders engaged in anti-Roosevelt cheers, awaiting the main address by a prominent U.S. congressman. They ignored the first news reports of the attack. The speaker delivered an anti-Roosevelt tirade, charging that the president was leading us into war, and included the standard non-interventionist line that U.S. industry, especially the munitions factories, were behind the war. Few of the members present knew, as they filed out of the auditorium, that their movement that had been so powerful and influential had literally evaporated as soon as the American public learned about the Japanese attack. Pearl Harbor was a stunningly successful military operation, brilliantly executed by the Japanese. 8 battleships, the heart of the American Pacific Fleet, were sunk. Despite the success of the attack, it was perhaps the greatest strategic blunder in the history of warfare. A diverse and quarreling nation, strongly pacifistic, was instantly changed into a single united people with a burning desire to wage war. The Japanese attack on the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor changed everything, but it was a high price to pay for non-interventionism. The initial cost of America's non-interventionist policies was the lives of 2,335 U.S. servicemen and 68 civilians. The isolationism that President Roosevelt had struggled against for over 7 years instantly disappeared. In today's world, intervention in the affairs of other nations, even on a humanitarian basis, continues to be a topic that causes heated arguments. With modern communications, transportation, and an increased reliance on international trade, isolationism may be a concept in name only, and one that may be impractical in our world. Americans learned a painful lesson on 9/11, that we are all part of one interconnected world. The two-ocean barrier that we have for so long hid behind is no longer the protection that we once counted upon. The definition of what and who defines what is deemed vital to the defense of the United States continues to be a point of contention at the highest levels of government. Because of the global economy, political decisions must be balanced against economic considerations, which will make those decisions even harder. Isolationism as a political strategy may be impractical in today's global economy. No industrialized nation can successfully sustain itself on the resources that it alone controls, nor can it support a modern industrialized economy without participation in international commerce. 1/4 of all jobs in this country are dependent upon sales to other countries. Another 1/4 is dependent upon either imported raw materials or parts imported from others. Still another sizable portion is dependent upon international travel. Non-interventionism, on the other hand, recognizes that the United States is interdependent upon the global economy. It does not, however, provide guidance on when one nation should intervene in conflict within or between other nations, even on a humanitarian basis. Nevertheless, American experiences throughout our history, up to including today, continue to add support to the arguments of non-interventionists. The argument that the U.S. interest in other nations do not justify the cost, both in terms of dollars and lives, is still highly emotional and one that will not likely end soon.